Amazing. You all look wonderful, and we're so happy to have you in this space with us. I'm Erica Smith, the Dean of the College at Connecticut College, and I am so pleased to welcome you all here to the ATHE Center for Performance and Research at Palmer Auditorium. We're here for our signature event, One Book, One Region, featuring author Judith Heumann and her memoir, Being Human, an Unrepentant Memoir of a Disability Rights Activist. I'm really looking forward to tonight's conversation, and I hope you all are too. I'd like to begin our time together tonight by acknowledging the land we currently occupy and to honor the Native peoples who were its first inhabitants. Specifically, we honor the Mashantucket Pequots, the Eastern Pequots, Mohegans, and other Native nations who are indigenous to Namiag, now called New London, and the land surrounding Algonquin, also known as the Long Island Sound region. We acknowledge that indigenous peoples have cared for this land over many generations and know that they endured suffering and violence through the historical period of settler colonialism and its legacy. Today, we strive to tell and retell the complete stories, to repair the harm, and to live together as neighbors in this region. Thank you. In a moment, you will hear more about the One Book, One Region initiative and its importance to our community. And then we will introduce tonight's featured guests, and after the discussion, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. We could not have planned tonight's event without the support of our community partners. So I have a lot of thank yous to read, so bear with me. I'd like to thank Bank Square Books, Connecticut College's Office of the President, the Frank Loomis Palmer Fund Bank of America NA trustee, UConn Avery Point, and of course the libraries of Southeastern Connecticut. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank my many wonderful colleagues at the college by name. Rodman King, Jody Goldstein, Teresa Smith, Justin Wolfrett, John Kramer, Jessica Lavelle, Tiffany Teely, Emily Morash, Rob Richter, Danielle Egan, Rebecca McHugh, Rodney Dumond, Merrill Collins, Aaliyah Strong, Ben Parent, Lori Looney, Stacy Lyon, which I have to say with some emphasis, Jim Guerin, and his custodial team, and Seamus Deniston and the campus safety team as well. So a lot of hands, a lot of hearts, a lot of effort went into putting this event together, and we're so grateful and uplifted by the community element of this event. You've all made this evening possible, and working together with all of you has been a true, true pleasure. I'd like to now introduce Christine Bradley, who is here representing One Book, One Region, to say a few words. Come on up, Christine.
Thank you, Erica. This is the 20th anniversary of One Book, One Region. Yeah, right. And I cannot think of a better book or a better author with which to celebrate. It all began back in 2002 when we chose Pete Hamill's novel, Snow in August. 19 wonderful reads written by the country's best authors have followed, including Khaled Hosseini's The Kite Runner, David Benioff's City of Thieves, Tracy Kidder's Mountains Beyond Mountains, Geraldine Brooks' Caleb's Crossing, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, and last year's Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. These books were chosen to inform, educate, and engage readers, and Judy Heumann has done all that in Being Human. This is the 7th year that Connecticut College has partnered with One Book, One Region to bring community members and the college community together to discuss ideas, broaden our appreciation of reading, and break down barriers among people. The titles and their authors change every year, but those goals remain the same. At this point, I was going to introduce President Catherine Bergeron, but I understand that she tested positive for COVID yesterday, so she cannot be with us. She's fine and isolating at home. So we have the Dean of Faculty of Connecticut College, Danielle Egan, with us in her stead to introduce our guest tonight. Dean Egan.
Thank you so much, Christine, and I echo the thanks of Dean Smith for everything you and your colleagues have done to nurture the One Book, One Region program over the past 20 years. I am pleased to be here on behalf of President Bergeron to welcome you to the Athey Center for tonight's conversation. Last year, the college was still in the throes of building renovation, so we couldn't host this event, which is why it is so meaningful to be together tonight in this beautifully restored space, a space that we are proud to say is now fully accessible for the first time in its 80-year history. Thank you all for being here. Tonight, we are going to hear from a remarkable woman, Judith Heumann, and about her extraordinary and timely memoir from 2020 called Being Human. The book was not just the chosen reading for the One Book, One Region program this year. It was also required reading for the 635 first-year students who entered Connecticut College in August. It is so wonderful to see so many of our students here tonight. A few weeks ago, during her opening of school convocation address, President Bergeron spoke about being human, and the message of Judy Heumann's book seemed remarkably apt for a ceremony that asks us to reflect on what it means to be welcomed into a community. This is also one of the founding ideas behind the One Book, One Region program, whose purpose, as Christine just said, is to support communal reading as a way of breaking down barriers and creating wider and wider circles of understanding. Our guest tonight is someone who has devoted her life to doing just that, creating wider and wider circles of understanding by fighting for the civil rights of disabled people, fighting for the conditions in which all people can be recognized and embraced as fully human. It was a vocation that started at a young age, supported by parents who fled Nazi Germany. It grew stronger as she fought to be recognized by the New York City public schools, and later as she pursued her college education and an advanced degree, and ultimately flourished as she connected with a larger community of activists committed to social change and social justice. In the 1960s, she was a founding partner at the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, California, and became an early proponent of what we now call full participation, creating environments that allow all people, no matter their circumstance, to live fully independent lives, to reach their highest potential, and to contribute to more just and equitable societies. Her success in nonprofit organizing and public advocacy eventually led her into government service and to significant roles under 3 administrations: as the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services under President Clinton, as the First Advisor on Disability and Development for the World Bank under President Bush, and as a special advisor for international disability rights at the U.S. Department of State under President Obama. Being Human is, as she says, her unrepentant memoir, and it tells the whole story. A story of injustices, of many acts of resistance, and many acts of love, and ultimately, the milestone victories of the disability rights movement she helped to catalyze. But what is perhaps most memorable about the book is the inspiring lesson it offers to all of us on living, on being present, open, curious, and alive to one another, and on seeing what is possible when we recognize each other and enable each other to be fully human. I fully expect that tonight's conversation will be a beautiful example of just that. I am pleased that sitting on stage with Judy tonight is our very own Jennifer Rudolph, Associate Professor of Sociology at Connecticut College. Professor Rudolph is a specialist in Latin American studies and disability studies with an interest in Latino expressive cultures, identity formation, transnationalism, and urban studies, and one of my favorites, baseball. She is teaching a class this semester on disability and society. And in June, during the kickoff to the One Book, One Region program, she delivered a compelling talk about her own work in this area and its connection to being human. We are grateful that she has agreed to lead this onstage conversation with our speaker tonight. So won't you join me in thanking Professor Rudolph while also giving our warmest and most enthusiastic welcome from this college and this region to Judy Heumann.
Wow. That's great.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. And I am so thrilled to be seated next to Judy Heumann, who I've had the pleasure and the privilege of getting to know most of the day and have been stunned by her energy and enthusiasm in many, many conversations. And I would also like to thank Dean Egan for that wonderful, generous introduction. And we are so glad that everyone is here to have this wonderfully important conversation about disability, which is really, I think, something that we could benefit from discussing publicly in forums like this more at Connecticut College. And I hope that this will be just the start of more and more conversations in this area. So, welcome, Judy. I just want to say one more time, welcome, welcome.
Great to be here.
So I kind of wanted to start with a little bit of a context about Being Human, which came out in 2020, as did the documentary Crip Camp. I don't know if the timing was any sort of a coincidence, but if you could speak a little bit about the process of those two things, but also writing the memoir with Kristen Joyner, that would be lovely.
So first of all, I want to thank you all for inviting us, and I'm so happy that this is a collaborative effort. One Book, One Region, and Connecticut College. And I was really honored to also One Book, One Region in San Diego, where they have a similar program, bigger city. But so it's great to see how books are being shared with so many people and convening people together to have discussions like this. So really thank you for inviting me. A couple of issues here. One, people have asked me to write a book for many years. I'm almost 75, and I guess I would say when I was in my 30s and 40s, because I like to talk stories. And so I've done a lot of public speaking for many years and would always partially discuss stories because I think they relate to other people who have their own stories. And people would say, oh, you need to write a book. And I'm like, I don't have time to write a book. I don't feel like I'm competent to write a book on my own. And then in 2016, when the elections occurred, I thought I was going to be working in President Clinton's administration, President Clinton too. But that didn't happen. And so it was around that time that I got a call from a company in California that said, we've heard about your story, and would you be interested in writing a book? And I said the same thing. And they said, well, but we can help you get an agent. They can help you find someone to write with you. So that's what happened. I moved from being in the Obama administration of the State Department, set up my own company, doing many different things, but one of which was also working on this book. And it was a really interesting experience to be writing a book with a woman who started out in California with her family, and she had a job in DC and was going back and forth. And then her husband and the family moved to New Zealand. So we were writing this book coast to coast, and then New Zealand to Washington, D.C. But it was a great opportunity. And you asked about the linkage between Crip Camp. There's no formal linkage, except for the fact that I'm in Crip Camp also, and my friends who directed the film, because we were very close friends, so they were also involved with the book in as much as I asked them to do some reading as we were going through our drafts. And it was very coincidental that our book came out like a month before the film. And the fact that they came out so closely together, I think, helped the book and helped the movie.
Absolutely. And you kind of started to go in a direction that I really wanted to take our conversation, in the fact that you begin the book with a note about collectivity and how you could only have been able to do your work with the support of others, and how collectivity is so important for the disability rights movement. Could you speak a little bit more about the importance of collectivity and where you think that we need to do more of that in disability movement rights now?
Yes, I think in any movement or any work going on for change, whether it's your religious organization, if you belong to one, your school, your corporation, community nonprofit, or in moving on the women's movement or disability rights movement, whatever. It's not one person that makes the change. And the issues that you're needing to deal with go beyond one person. There are many people who are experiencing something that they want to see changed. So the ability for people to come together and identify what are the areas where they want change, what are people's views on how they want that change to happen, and who they can be working with to enable that change to occur as quickly as possible. And quickly sometimes is very slowly. But, so I think for me, I had polio in 1949, and so as I was getting older and experiencing various forms of discrimination, and my parents were, out of necessity, getting more engaged, and also realizing that what I was experiencing was the same thing that many, many other people were experiencing kind of all over the world. And so slowly, people began to work together. I would say in my family, the first area was my mother working on getting me into school, but then working with other parents who had kids with disabilities, getting us into high school, and many different areas that we began to work in, and many different organizations that were involved in this. So ultimately, I think what's been very important is the growth, in this case, of the disability rights movement, is occurring because more people are identifying as having disabilities, are willing to speak up not only about the fact that they have a disability, but also what are the barriers that they're experiencing and what types of changes are people wanting to make. And I think you know that one of the important aspects of this is also to look at history. How have things evolved? What changes have been made? How have they been made? But in disability, like in gender or race or other areas, it's just not even the work of the affected group, but it's also being able to help enable larger communities to understand what the issues are and to become engaged in helping to make changes that will affect, in this case, the disability community, but the broader communities overall.
I'd like to stay with your family and what you were just speaking about with your mother and advocating for your education for a minute. One of the things that you talk about in your prologue is that your mother was a staunch advocate and really did what she could to get you to be able to navigate the New York City public schools that were trying to keep you out, but she also was sort of navigating the fact that she was concerned at some points that people might push back and think of this as a burden. And I think that for a lot of parents and families with children with disabilities, that's such a hard thing to navigate, is you want to push and do as much as you possibly can to get your children everything that they are legally and as human beings entitled to have, but there's always that concern about pushback and how other people are going to then view the child as a burden. What advice would you give to families, especially if they are experiencing resistance from the public school that they're working with?
Know your rights. That's my summary. Know what the law says. Get a better understanding of why you're being told that what you're asking for is not appropriate. Think about it. But at the end of the day, very frequently what it is that the parents are striving for is appropriate. Not 100% of the time, but in many cases. And I think, there's a need to ensure that, one of my feelings overall is we need to be supporting public education much more than we are, not just in the area of disability, but across the board. And that public education in this country is really in a crisis state. And it's really the fabric of our country. And it's not just disabled children who are not necessarily receiving the education they need, but poor children, other marginalized populations. And down the road, those are the people that we have to really count on to be able to advance our country. And so education, to me, has to be pivotal. And I think in the area of education for disabled children, there's still a lot more work that needs to be done where teachers are being trained appropriately on how to work with diverse learners that include disabled students, but not only disabled students. And that, people are being given the knowledge and the tools to make accommodations in classrooms and getting the support that the children need to be able to successfully participate in school. I think the studies show that inclusion of disabled children doesn't just benefit disabled children, but benefits the entire class. And too frequently, again, I think people aren't aware of research that's been done, for example, which demonstrates the benefit to disabled kids and non-disabled children. So I think, as I was saying, most parents, it's hard to fight against a school district. So if a parent is really pushing for something for their children or their child, I would say, listen to what they're saying, because if they're really continuing to move forward, it's something they believe in. And it's not typically something that they shouldn't believe in. They know things about their children, and they can see how their children can benefit and how denial of appropriate education really reduces that possibility.
One thing that you mentioned also in your prologue that really struck me, and also because of what you've just been talking about in terms of visibility of folks with disabilities and people needing to sort of lead the movement, but it also being a collective movement, is you say both at the beginning of the book and at the end, "I never wished I didn't have a disability." Can you speak a little bit more about sort of your intentionality in that phrase, or where you see that, sort of how you see that within the rest of the book and as part of your life and work as an activist?
Yeah, I mean, my life has been as a disabled person. So I've never really wanted to think about my life as being anything but who I am. And it's an issue to really say, well, if you didn't have this disability, you wouldn't be facing these barriers. But that's not a reality. And so for me, it's what do we need to be changing in society? I guess in some way, the first question is, why has society been constructed in such a way as to negate the contributions of people, in this case, who have various forms of disabilities? But certainly we're not the only group that's been negated. But for me, I have felt it's important to really look at the changes that need to be made, that can be made, and that if I call a disability lens is put on the work that we're doing, then you're thinking about it in the beginning, not an afterthought. So, for example, when we just heard that this auditorium is now accessible after 80 years, the question is, not just for Connecticut College, but why was something built 80 years ago that didn't think about people becoming older, having difficulty with steps, people breaking their legs, people coming back from World War I or World War II, who should be able to participate in society. So it's this kind of avoidance of people. And so for me, it's been, what do we need to do to ensure that people are included, not to be setting something up where our big wish and hope is, cure me.
Absolutely. I want to return to another moment toward the beginning of the book where you describe a situation where you and I believe some of your friends as a child are going to a candy store and another child repeatedly asks you if you're sick when he sees you in your wheelchair. And you say, and this is, and I quote, this was the first time I realized I wasn't expected to be part of this world. And you said that initially you were silent, you didn't really talk about it with your parents. So can you speak a little bit about what sort of broke that silence for you, and was that one of the moments where you started to kind of see yourself as an advocate in the future, or just knowing that you would need to do something?
So, I was 8 years old, and I think what I did see was that people saw me differently. And it's not that I didn't know in some way that people saw me differently before, but I think this was the first time that anyone had been so specific. Are you sick? And the meaning of sick, when you're younger, like 5, 6, whatever, you don't know, but at the age of 8, the word sick begins to have a different meaning. And so I think for me that was partly what was going on, that I was recognizing that this child didn't see me as a peer, and didn't see me as a peer because I was in a wheelchair. And because of the lack of visibility of disabled people in comics, on television, in general society at that point, in schools and other things, we were out of sight, out of mind. And so if you're out of sight, out of mind, then why are you out of sight, out of mind? And now when you're in public view, is the reason you haven't been included because you've been sick. Because if you're sick, you're contagious. so you don't go around other people. So I think that was a point for me when I started at an 8-year-old level, thinking about what this meant. But I think it was important because how many of you have seen Crip Camp? Okay. I hope you all watch it. It's a good film. It was nominated for an Oscar in 2020. But it's a piece, it's a documentary on the disability rights movement. And I think what you can see in part through that film, which starts out with teenagers, is, in this case, disabled teenagers who are, 1, teenagers, 2, so they're going through being a teenager. But they're also recognizing that in many ways they're treated differently, and how to be able to start adjusting to that when, we were teenagers and we wanted to be able to do the same thing that other teenagers without disabilities were doing. So I think it was this growing recognition that we were really beginning to be our own spokespeople and beginning to look for what it was we wanted in our life as opposed to what society was planning. So, if you've read the book, you'll see that I didn't start going to school till I was 9 years old. And then I was only in classes with disabled children, which was very common at that point. But then my mother and other parents learned that if you were a child like myself who couldn't walk steps, you went back onto home instruction after the 8th grade, because the high schools weren't accessible. But my mother and other mothers worked and got the Board of Ed to make high schools accessible, so we didn't have to go back onto home instruction. But again, this complete lack of responsibility. And it was before there were any laws like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act or the Americans with Disabilities Act or Section 504. So this was parents who were basically saying, no, enough was enough. So getting back to your question about families with their kids in school, if it wasn't for my mother and many other parents, it would have eventually happened. But when, who knows? And so I think that's why you trust in the efforts of parents when they're really up against a lot of forces that are not necessarily supportive of the change that needs to be made.
Absolutely, and this is such a wonderful conversation because you led toward a direction I wanted to go next. Was you both mentioned in Being Human, but it also comes up in Crip Camp, this idea of almost living in 2 separate worlds. Like when you were in Camp Gen Ed with other disabled folks and when you were living in the Center for Independent Living, you felt like you could really live fully within your community and be your full self, but you felt like you were not able to do that in the same way in the non-disabled world. Can you speak a little bit more about that and how that, how that has sort of changed over your life and just where that has sort of how you've navigated living in those 2 separate worlds?
So I grew up in Brooklyn and did my undergraduate work in Brooklyn, got my teaching license after suing the New York City Board of Education and taught in New York for 3 years, and then I needed to get a master's degree. And I'd been accepted into Columbia. But I got a call from a gentleman named Ed Roberts in California that they were starting this new organization called the Center for Independent Living. It was not a residential program. It was a community-based organization that was created and run by disabled individuals. You've got a number of centers for independent living here in Connecticut. And the purpose of those organizations is to work with disabled people on empowerment, policy, changing laws, addressing financial issues, both for individuals and planning and things of that nature. And that the University of California, Berkeley, in the School of Public Health, and in city and regional planning were interested in affirmatively recruiting disabled people. So I was asked if I would be interested in applying, and I got into the School of Public Health, and also when I left New York, went to California to go to graduate school, but also got involved with the Berkeley CIO. And what was very exciting about that organization at that time and moving forward was that it was an organization run by disabled people. It's not that there were non-disabled people who didn't work there, they did. And non-disabled people were supportive of work that we were doing, but it was led by disabled people. When I first got there, it was working primarily with people who were like young adults through seniors, because most of the people who were working there had acquired their disabilities when they were older, teenagers or older. Ed had gotten polio when he was 14, and one of the other people was spinal cord injured when he was also older. But a number of us moved out from New York, and we began to also work with families and children who had disabilities. So it became an organization that was intergenerational. And I think what was very important for me with CIL and with graduate school was how in the community there was a lot of work going on for change. So when we were looking at trying to address issues of inclusive housing, and we were assisting disabled people in looking at apartments, for example, that were up to be rented. We also were learning about discriminatory practices that landlords had about not wanting to rent to disabled people and having to do work in that area. And also we were doing work on employment. So we had a program with about 10 staff that were working with disabled people and businesses to work with disabled people and getting their resumes together, learning how to do interviews, applying for jobs, etc. We were doing a lot, suing the county for failure to be ordering accessible buses, participating in demonstrations to get that policy changed so that they did order accessible buses, working with the school districts. We were doing many, many different things, and it was a really empowering period of time because it was also bringing together disabled people who had many different types of disabilities who hadn't necessarily worked together. And the objective was working, as I've said, on the empowerment of disabled people, educating government, educating communities on what the barriers were and what we needed to be doing together to make changes in our communities. So that's been, a very effective model that continues to move forward. But for those of you who've seen Criff Camp or read the book, you know about the 504 demonstrations. And 504 demonstrations really could not have occurred in the Bay Area. San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, and other parts of the Bay Area, if there hadn't been some very strong disability rights organizations that, where the voices of disabled people were pretty clear on what it was we wanted. We were also becoming much more knowledgeable about laws and regulations and what they were and how to analyze things and how to be able to refute what other people were saying. So it was very, I think, very exciting period of time.
Yeah, and when you talk about the 504 sit-ins, you also talk about how they were so collaborative. Again, I know we keep coming back to this idea of being collaborative, and I think that's so important. You talk about the participation of the Black Panthers in assisting the group that was in San Francisco. I believe the Machinists Union helped to fund the trip to DC that eventually you and a group of others did. One of the things that you also mentioned that I think really we need to highlight in thinking about the disability rights movement and your role from an intersectional perspective is you talk about being a woman doing this work, and you say, and I quote, "I walked a fine line between being seen as strong and being seen as unlikable." And I think that women are much more susceptible to that than men. And so can you speak a little bit about how you've navigated that gender dynamic as a disability rights activist, or, you know, do you just kind of dismiss it completely? Like, how do you work with that?
I mean, I think what we were seeing in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and moving forward were a couple of things. The women's movement itself getting stronger, although disabled women have not yet been as integrated into the women's movement as ultimately we would like to see. But disabled women ourselves were coming together and really within our own ranks, pushing within disability groups to be able to look at the biases that exist and what we had to do to address some of those issues. So I would say organizations like the National Council on Independent Living, which is an umbrella group for more than 500 organizations in the 90s and late 80s, started pushing to get our first woman elected as the chairperson of the board. And basically, we're able to throw out the ticket of people that were very good, but it was really time for disabled women to be moving into positions of responsibility. And so I think that continues to go on. But I think when we look at things like the glass ceiling, and we look at the fact that non-disabled women still are earning less than non-disabled men, if you take that group of white disabled women, black disabled women, Latino disabled women, on, you'll find that white non-disabled women are earning more than white disabled women, who are earning more than than black disabled women, on. So women with disabilities are still not on parity with non-disabled people, for sure. So it's a lot of work that needs to be done, but again, I think this is something that we've seen more disabled women within the movement moving into positions. But when we look at corporate tables, for example, I mean, one of the major changes that happens is when you bring groups of people who are marginalized to corporate tables, you know, being hired as CEOs and other senior people, you begin to see changes within those companies. But the changes that we're wanting to see in the area of disability with these companies is slowly happening, but not to the same degree yet as for other groups, because we still don't have people in significant ways in positions of leadership and responsibility who, in fact, are looking behind them to bring people like themselves who are qualified into positions without the bias that may exist otherwise.
Absolutely. So turning kind of to the current moment a little bit, but also toward the end of the memoir, it's the Trump election has just happened, and that was such a moving part for me when you said, "What have we done?" I could not agree more. And so we had elected a president as a country that actually mocked a disabled reporter on in a public speech, and so obviously there were concerns about how disabled rights might be rolled back and how the legal system even might be used to do that during that administration. So I'm wondering if you could speak about what you think maybe a little bit about long-term effects maybe of what the Trump administration has been able to do, but then also how would you rate Joe Biden's administration in terms of, do you think his administration is improving as much as it needs to?
So for me, because I worked in a senator's office and worked in government, I understand that it isn't a president, whoever they are, that's going to be able to make the changes by themselves. So I think one of the big issues right now is we have a House and a Senate which are barely controlled by the Democrats. If we had more people in the House and Senate side who understood the issues, then I think definitely we would be making more progress. I mean, in spite of that, I think we've been making important progress. But if you look at the Build Back Better legislation that the president had put forward a couple years ago that went no place, one of the important aspects of Build Back Better was there was like $450 billion for Medicaid home and community-based services, which would have gotten rid of the waiting lists that exist around the country. But that didn't happen. And so the waiting lists are still there. Now, is that Biden's fault? In my view, no, because the administration proposed what needed to happen, but we couldn't get the votes. So I feel that the barriers that the Trump administration has been, and its long-term effect, for me is of deep concern, because the courts are so very important, and the Supreme Court, as we know now, with decisions like Roe, overturning of Roe, are things that we need to be very concerned about. And in the disability area, we're looking at many other approaches that are going to be made to take away the rights of disabled people to file complaints, for example. But it will also address gender and race and issues around sexual orientation. So it's we really have to be looking at the long game. We have to have much clearer understanding of, what role does the Senate play? What role does the House play? What role does state elected representatives play in selecting state judges, on and on? Because these systems are supposed to work together. And I think we need fair and equitable judges who are willing to look at the laws and look at the intent and look at the reality of what's going on in people's lives and not be dogmatic in their approaches. And I think my parents are from, we're German Jews, and so some of the things that are going on right now are, to me, of deep concern, not only as a disabled person, but the distrust of government that people are being led to believe you can't trust your government. And, nothing is perfect in life, and I worked in government for many years, but I also know there are a lot of great government workers who really are trying to do the right thing in complex situations. So, deep concern about also the longer-term impact of Trump, and hoping that in some of the issues that are being addressed now, that we have some reasoned judges that will be able to address what otherwise they think could be major problems for the country.
Yeah, and some disability studies scholars have said that the bipartisan cooperation that led to the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 is unlikely to happen again. Do you see a way that, especially given the polarization politically right now in this country, do you think that there's a possibility of the Democrat and Republican parties working together around disabilities in the near future?
I mean, I'm from New York, right? And you're from Connecticut. And when I was growing up, there were a lot of Republicans who I might not have voted for them, but I didn't disrespect them. People like Senator Jacob Javits and Lefkowitz and others. they were reasoned people. So do I see a day where the Republican Party can move in a direction which is not the direction they're in right now? I certainly hope so. But at the moment, I don't think it's something which is happening too rapidly. But the elections in the fall, I think, are going to be really critical. And I think, bipartisanship on disability is a tragedy when it can't occur. So there's something called the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which came into force in 2008. It's a treaty which is modeled on the Americans with Disabilities Act, and now has been ratified by more than 175 countries. And when I worked in the Obama administration in the Department of State, we were working to, the way it goes in the US is, if there's a UN treaty and we want to ratify it, the Senate, by a 2/3 vote, has to agree that they want the treaty, and then they vote that they want the president to sign it or to ratify it. We could not get more than 5 Republicans to agree to that. And so we lost. And the tragedy in that is, we've got many good laws, and so yes, the treaty would have an impact on us, but it has a stronger impact in other countries where they don't have laws like this. And our failure to ratify also means that we can't actively participate. So there's a committee that does review of the work going on in countries and makes recommendations of what to happen. We can't be on that committee. When the UN meets to discuss what's going on in disability, we can't speak because every country that's ratified gets to speak before us. And since there's us and 2 or 3 other countries, we never get to speak. So that's like a simple example of something which ultimately does have a negative impact on people in our country. Because, like at Connecticut College, more and more colleges and universities are requiring that students do part of their undergraduate work overseas. Well, if the countries that people have to go to are not that accessible, and if biases exist in those countries, we are not playing a positive role in helping other countries make the changes they need so that U.S. citizens can study abroad, can work in our State Department, and can work in other government agencies where they're being positioned overseas because of lack of accessibility or discrimination, where their kids may be going to school when they're in another country, on and on. So bipartisanship to me is a no-brainer, but when you look at things in such a narrow way, it's very difficult.
So I feel like maybe we have time for one more question, being conscious of the time, and I really would like...
We're opening it up to the audience.
Yes,
right?
we are. I have time for one more question, then we are opening up to you all, and looking forward to that, but I kind of would like to end with a little bit of a conversation about the COVID pandemic. We are continuing to navigate, despite some people saying it seems to be over, but it's not. And we know that this has had a particular impact both on folks with disabilities, but also people of color and poor folks as well. So to the point that you've been making all evening, we can't see disability in isolation without looking at class and without looking at race and without looking at gender as well. And I would add citizenship, because another thing that was a huge problem with COVID is that folks who are undocumented are severely undertreated and died because they were afraid to even seek assistance. But within the specific disabled community, some folks were denied vaccines or had a very hard time getting them. The priority of who was going to get hospital beds, there was exclusion of folks with disabilities. And so what do you see as, and then also I would like to add before I ask my question, COVID long haulers are now also going to be another disabled group because COVID if you are a COVID long hauler, it's seeming like that's going to be something that's going to impact you perhaps for the rest of your life based on the research so far. So what do you see as the advocacy work or what needs to be done to bring more equity to the situation and to get folks with disabilities what they need in terms of COVID and just sort of to acknowledge even what has been done to the disabled community by the inequalities visited on them through COVID protocols and treatment?
I think it's a great question, and so I would say a number of things have happened. One is what we've seen are the results of many years where organizations like Protection Advocacy and other disability rights groups have been developing and becoming stronger, more knowledgeable, more influential, so that as some of these policies were being rolled forward that were threatening disabled people's ability to get adequate health care, if in fact they had gotten sick, they were able to push back within Health and Human Services and state agencies to help prevent some of these draconian policies that were going to move forward. The bigger question I think that you're also asking is the healthcare disparities that exist in this country. And in the disability community, we talk about hundreds of thousands of disabled people who died because they had what is called underlying conditions, diabetes, hypertension, others that we and the law would say have disabilities. So we haven't really counted the number of people who have died as a result of COVID because of their disabilities, except I think more of that's being done right now. But the community is really becoming more organized around this, and that is only the result of decades of work getting people who are knowledgeable about laws and practices. Now, our public health system really needs to be strengthened, just like I was discussing our public education system. Public health needs to be in a position so that all communities are prepared not just for COVID, but for other types of health risks, which will continue to come forward to make sure that poor and marginalized populations of people, in fact, are not in the back of the line. And again, to me, it's really making sure that people feel that their voice matters and that they are holding elected representatives accountable. So one of the big other concerns is what's going on in some states around voting rights and laws that are being put in place to restrict people's ability to vote, which really obviously includes disabled individuals, poor, and other marginalized populations. But again, there's some good work going on with groups like the American Association of People with Disabilities, which has a program called Rev Up, which is working on voting rights, and they're working with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. So these kinds of consortiums are being created. But you know, in everything, I always think it's really important to talk about the progress that we are making, yet we know how much yet needs to be done. And I think that's why discussions like this are really important, but they're not just something that stays in a room. I mean, I think Crip Camp, my book, Alice Wong's book, and many others are really out there to help people think more deeply about what role are people individually playing in trying to address issues of discrimination against all groups of people, and what we need to be doing within our communities to really make changes so that we can feel with greater confidence that people are not being left behind. And we should open it up.
Yes, thank you for that. And I believe we're going to open it up to questions, and Dean Smith is going to help with that.
Erica.
You all were right on cue. That was great. That was great. So I just want to say thank you for this really inspiring conversation that we'll get to actually continue in this space a little bit. We have a little bit of time for Q&A. There are microphones on the floor on either side. So I'd invite anyone with questions to come to one of the microphones, and we will field some questions for a period of time.
Well, thank you for tonight, and I wanted to ask, I'm on the school board in a neighboring district, and we talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but then we still use words like push-in for services, and to me, that's just vernacular that should be completely eliminated. I'm a speech pathologist. After 35 years working, advocating for kids to be in the classroom, I feel like we should be past that, and we're not. We still say we don't include the kids in the classroom, we push them in. Are there other words like that that maybe are a sticky point for you that you think we should change? What do you think about the language?
I think language is very important. I also think, the broader point that you're making, which is what is it that you're trying to accomplish? Right, and so you're trying to ensure that children are being included, and that the term push-in clearly isn't respectful of what one means when we're talking about kids being included in the classroom. So I think we can argue about the word, but the bigger issue is what is it that people don't understand about what needs to be happening? What are the practices that are out there that are seen to be good practices, and what do we do to help ensure that these teachers are being appropriately trained and the administrators are being appropriately trained, and that when parents are talking about they want more than their kid being pushed in the classroom, that they're respected for what they're saying.
Obviously, let's say, they pride themselves on being accessible. Like, they invited you here. We've talked about how the space is newly accessible, but a lot of the buildings, especially residential buildings that were built 180, 60 years ago, are not ADA compliant. There's no elevators in a number of the dorms. In the building I live in, if you used a wheelchair, you could get into the common room, and there's 3 little steps up. You can't get in the room, you can't get in the building. You can't, there's wheelchair accessible showers on the 3rd floor, and there's no way for a wheelchair to get up there. But how do you think us as students what do you think is the best way for us to urge the school to continue their efforts?
I think you need to be meeting with the leadership of the school. You need to be looking at what the plans are for the school as far as renovations that they're making. I mean, the law says new construction and renovation. So you see a 3rd floor bathroom being modified because that's where they're making modifications. But the question is, do they have plans in the future to continue to be modifying the building so that elevators will be put in? And also to make sure that there are alternative ways that students can participate equally with other students. So I think, particularly with older buildings, it's an issue. But the other is I would look to other universities who have old buildings and look at what they're doing to deal with issues of renovations. And then there's also a group called the U.S. Access Board, based in D.C., and they're kind of group that could be helpful in looking at some of these issues and giving some guidance. But is it in the plans? Is it in the strategic plan? Is it in the work that the university is doing as far as renovations overall are concerned?
Hi, my name is Wesley. It's an honor to talk to you. I am in a first-year seminar that talks a lot about the power of our stories. And right now we're looking a lot at disability justice and about how to make meaningful action. And so I was curious about kind of what advice you would have for those who are looking to either get or stay involved in activism, to make sure that their actions are effective and thoughtful and taking inspiration from those who came before, because I know that there's a lot of talk about how to, get involved. Yeah.
First of all, I think, for me, I like to look at putting a disability lens on work. So it isn't that you have to be only working within a disability group, but ultimately what we're talking about is making reforms that allow disabled people, whether they have a visible or invisible disability, to enter spaces. And I'm not just talking about physical spaces, but what are the views of people within the group and the issues that they're working on? Are disabled people participating in those discussions as equal members? Is the group willing to listen to what disabled students or faculty or whoever they are, just community people, are saying to ensure that, for example, meetings are being held in accessible places, accommodations are being made so people can appropriately participate, people feel heard in what they're doing. So I think, it's nothing, it's what many groups are working on to try to be more inclusive of race and gender and sexual orientation. But I think in the case of disability, we're wanting to make sure that it's also the diversity of the disability community that is being integrated into work that's happening. So disability studies, I think, are really important, but like gender studies are important to have disability studies as a part of gender studies, and queer studies to have issues around disabled people in those studies, and Black studies, etc. So it shouldn't be where disability studies is the only area where you're learning about disability issues. It should be linked, in this case, across the board, because the issues, there's similar issues and they're different issues. And it's really important, I think, to be able to more comprehensively address some of these issues and bring voices of people and issues that haven't been appropriately looked at before.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lana. It's also an honor to meet you. And you mentioned it in your answer to Wesley's question, bringing up both visible and invisible disabilities. And I guess as an autistic person, an invisible disability, I guess there's always a degree of imposter syndrome that comes with identifying with and connecting with the disabled community. And I'm not quite sure what my question is, but I was just wondering, do I have permission? No. But what advice do you have for connecting with disabled people while also not speaking over the voices of disabled people that I do have privilege over, if that makes sense?
I mean, the way you're going to learn about whether you're speaking over people is to listen to people who you're working with to see if you're disregarding them.
Yeah.
And I think, learning about, and this is not just a disability issue, right? I mean, some people are more soft-spoken than others. And so people who speak up more and louder, their views are going to maybe be heard more than others unless you give time to ensure that people who have different ways of sharing information where that can happen. But I think, in Crip Camp, you see part of the discussion that's going on is the hierarchy of disability. And so there, I think what's being looked at is people whose disability makes them look less like a disabled person, and more like a non-disabled person. So if you speak the same way as a non-disabled person, then that might give you a point that would allow you to be seen as more acceptable versus someone who has a speech disability, uses the communication board, whatever their disability may be, that may impact the way they communicate. So I think really it gets to a lot of work and really enabling people to listen to each other. And I think, one thing you see in Crip Camp is very much how people listen to other people. And people ask that question all the time, why did that happen? And I think the reason it happened is we valued what we were hearing. So in the beginning, it might have been, I don't understand you, just not listen. But if you took the time to listen, like in that discussion around the table with what Nancy was saying, and how people were really trying to understand what she was saying, and how that really was valuable for the group, that was one of the ways that I think people really were learning, is that listening and waiting, you would get information that not only represented the views of other people, but also allowed you the ability to be respectful of how people share their ideas.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Welcome.
Okay, hi. My name's John David de Oliveira, I could say, and I'm actually a college student from Mitchell College in the other side of this town. And
glad you made the trip.
Oh, okay, thank you. And the thing is, and I guess my question is just, what is it? Hold on a minute. Oh, I was just going to say, near the beginning of this talk, I think you mentioned something called, you said that people with disabilities weren't, meaning in this country in general, weren't mentioned in a lot of TV shows or stuff like that, or meaning similar to TV shows. And I just think that even though I do have autism and I'm a person, with autism, I think that, that's a pretty insignificant part, if you want to say, of supporting people with disabilities. I think that and I just wanted to, what can I say? Sorry, I just, what do you call it? It's not that I forgot, it's just I don't know how to explain this.
Try again.
Okay.
It's okay.
Okay. Okay, so it's just, I think that people, or at least, people with disability, what I was talking about, people with disabilities in TV shows and stuff like that. And I think that, why did you mention that in the first place, meaning?
Why did I?
Yeah, why did you mention that?
Oh, because I think it's important for us to see each other. So, when we don't see ourselves, whether women or Black or Latino or from the LGBT community or Asian or whatever it may be, if we're not seen, if we're not heard, then we're invisible.
Okay, because I just thought, the reason why yeah, the reason why I mentioned that is just because I think that's a, you know, and I understand what you're saying too, but I think that, you know, like supporting people with disabilities, when you think about that term, I think that it's, you know, actually helping them in person and not so much through TV shows.
Oh, I don't think it's an either or, but I do think it does help people in person. Because, like you're speaking tonight, and you're identifying as someone who's autistic, does make a difference, right? A, because you're acknowledging you have a disability, which is autism, and you're talking about, we're having a discussion on an issue. That's very important. And it doesn't mean that you should be 100% of every TV program or movie that's going to be made, but it does mean that people who have different racial backgrounds, different types of disabilities, should be portrayed, maybe representing their disability or not. But, you know, I feel as a viewer, I want my children to see people like themselves. Like when I turn on children's programming and I see children from all backgrounds, but I don't see a deaf person, a blind person, a physically disabled person, etc., ever, what does it say to someone who's 6, 8, 10 years old? They're not there. So that's why I think media is one of the areas that's really important. But thank you for your question. Thank you.
Hi, Judy.
Hi.
I'm Will.
Hi, Will.
I've been in disability services for about 20 years. I work at an agency just 5 minutes down the road. And I am in awe of Crip Camp. I use Crip Camp as a staff development program that you watch. And then whenever I'm bummed out and feeling down about whatever's going on, I always put that on. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for that. And then how do you push person first language? In our agency, I push it just by leading by example, by being a role model as best as I can, but then when you walk out the door, things change, and you don't hear that as much. So what would your recommendation be as a society member to be able to help push that person's first language? Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So what you're discussing is the issue of people with disabilities versus disabled people. Right?
Yes, intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Yeah. So this is the way I deal with it. I use identity first language. And my friends who have intellectual or developmental disabilities, some of them use disabled people. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, they use disabled people. Other groups are using people with disabilities. Either of those, for me, my preference is disabled people. I don't like it when people are using, all kinds of other euphemisms, the able disabled, the blah, 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 or whatever. So those two phrases, disabled people or people with disabilities, for me, that's the parameter that we should be playing in. And, I went to a meeting a number of years ago with a group of people. I also don't like the word self-advocates, because advocates are advocates. When you use the word self-advocate, it means you're talking about people with developmental disabilities, and I don't like separating people out. That's me. Because I feel anyone with a disability should be called a disability advocate. There shouldn't be a distinguishing characteristic, which I feel automatically makes somebody looked at differently. So I don't do that. But I think language is important. The discussion around people with disabilities really started, in the 70s for a very legitimate reason, where, people who had intellectual disabilities felt that they were not being treated as a person, living in institutions, etc. My feeling is other movements don't use the word people first. I'm not a person who's a woman. I'm not a person who's a Jew, a person who's Latino. You're Latino, you're Hispanic, you're black, whatever. So I feel if you don't know that I'm a person saying I'm a person with a disability, you don't get the distinction anyway. But if that's the language that somebody who has the disability wants to use, I'm fine with that.
Hi, I'm Megan. I'm a freshman here at Con. And as somebody who's gone through a multitude of invisible illnesses and chronic illnesses throughout my teenage years and like middle school years, I mainly wanted, as somebody who's been wheelchair bound, walking bound, back and forth multitude of times, I wanted to talk mainly about 504s and how difficult they are to obtain and how bad it is to advocate for yourself in a classroom even though you have these 504. I wanted to really like touch upon what your opinion on how these 504s are actually proceeding and if they're proceeding well, if we could do better, because I know we could definitely do better, especially with my experience, having to advocate for myself and passing out in classrooms because they don't accommodate for my needs. So I kind of wanted to hear what you think, in your opinion, as working in government and being a person of disability, how you like connect with that and how it should be going.
Well, long question. I think kind of in a very basic way, people need to understand what a 504 plan is, what it is and what it isn't. And I think a lot of what happens with many laws is that people are not really understanding the full intent of the law. And now I'm not just talking about you as a disabled person who needs a 504 plan, but also the people who have responsibility for reviewing and determining, is there a need for a 504 plan and what should go into it? So I think discussions and knowledge and sharing, looking at good practices, is really what's important. And ultimately, a 504 plan is to help ensure that a student is getting what they need. So I know sometimes it can be very difficult. I think, it's similar to what goes on in some colleges and what they require students to have in order to be able to get accommodations. Some places are much more rigid and others are much more, I think, appropriate in understanding that you see certain things, students need certain things, the accommodation can help them get what they need to be successful. So, yeah. Okay.
So I'm going to break in for just 1 second. You all have been doing such a beautiful job self-moderating. I haven't had to do any work up here at all. The only piece of work I'm going to do is say that the folks who are standing at the microphones are the last questions that we're going to take. Part of my role here is to kind of manage the time a little bit. So for the folks who are already up, we'll take those questions and then we'll stop the Q&A and move into a book signing.
Hi, Judy. First of all, thank you so much for this evening. It was awesome. I'm Riley. And I'm Liv. We're freshmen from Municipal College. And in our first year seminar class with our amazing professor, Meredith Adler, we talk not only...
Can you come a little closer to the mic?
We talk not only a lot about the physical disabilities, but also the mental health part of it. And we were wondering what kind of mental health has kind of come along with a physical disability.
What kind of mental health?
If there's been kind of any issues, any mental barriers, mental blocks that have kind of come with coming to terms with a disability.
Oh. I think that's very individual. I wouldn't say that there's an answer per se. I mean, for me, like any form of discrimination, there's a need to be able to grapple with what's happening. And I've pretty much, and many of my friends have really, looked at addressing some of these issues from an organizing perspective. But people with physical disabilities some have mental health disabilities, like depression or anxiety or bipolar or learning disabilities, whatever it may be. And it may or may not be associated with the fact that they have a physical disability. But, you know, people have multiple disabilities. And one shouldn't say, because one has a physical disability, that rules out any other kinds of disabilities, because that's ridiculous. I think statistically it'd be interesting to look at the number of people with physical disabilities who have mental health disabilities. That'd be an interesting study. Some of my friends do, and many of my friends don't. I don't think we're more or less, I think probably it's pretty consistent with the overall population of people. One can become very angry or upset about the discrimination that we're experiencing, but whether or not that rises to the level of a disability depends on the individual person.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi there. My name's Mia. It's a pleasure to be here. I've really appreciated your talk. I guess we've talked a bit about visibility and like presence in various spaces, and there's this issue with colleges not being accessible, and then no one applies to come to the college, and it's kind of, sorry, the echo is kind of distracting me. Yeah, where their colleges aren't acceptable, and then people don't come here, and then it's kind of seen as like, oh, there's no one to cater to. Why do we really need to prioritize this issue if no one's here? And it's really this cycle that just prevents accessibility. So since changing the culture is, also we've talked about changing the culture and how it's a huge part of accessibility, where like with having access needs accepted, you know, when people even have formal accommodations that are written in, there's still this cultural issue. So I think like taking these together, I'm kind of wondering, how have you dealt with breaking a narrative of unimportance of these issues, specifically in a way to create prioritization of an issue for activism?
We've got the law 504 and ADA. It really doesn't matter whether there are any physically disabled students on a campus. As an example, the law and regulations require what needs to happen. New construction, renovations have to meet a certain code, which may be higher if the state has a standard which exceeds the federal code. And that is something we have to adhere to, because I think many of us believe that the more accessible a campus is, the more students who have, in this case, physical disabilities, are likely to apply to come. And likewise, I think universities that have a good reputation of accommodating students' needs so that students are coming into the school, graduating from the school, able to discuss the benefit of the accommodations they received and the learning they were able to benefit from. I think all of that's very important. And also, it needs to be something which in this case, schools of education, need to be highlighting in their literature. So does the literature of the college or university include disability in its discussions of diversity? And does it do it in a meaningful way or in a kind of low-level way? I mean, if you're talking about diversity on college campuses, which many students are looking for, including disability as a group that's a part of the diversity on campus is important. Are there pictures that are being utilized in the book? Do the pictures reflect diversity in them? Are there all kinds of things that, you know, are cues for applicants or for parents whose kids might be applying? I think we have one more question.
Hi, I think my question will be quick, but my name is Ariana, and I was wondering, since you've spoken so much about the importance of having a mentor or someone who children can look up to from a young age, have you ever considered being a part of a show or doing a documentary specifically targeting children so that you could be a mentor for them?
I'm actually working with 2 people on a children's book. So the children's book is likely going to come out in 2024. And there's also a movie that's being made on the book, which... So 2024 might be an exciting year.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I just want to thank everyone for the really thoughtful questions and engagement. That was a fantastic conversation all around. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I do hope that everyone continues your own conversations about this extraordinary book, extraordinary work, and continue work on your own. Please note that upon exiting, there will be a book signing as well in the lobby with books available for sale provided by Bank Square Books. And if you would all just please join me one more time in giving a really generous round of applause to Judith Heumann and Jennifer Rudolph